Sam Shaw here, founder of Wall Street Mastermind. I'm back today with another client interview for you guys. And today I'm excited to have Lee on with us. Lee just finished going through the summer 2023 recruiting process. We're recording this as of late April. So yeah, he actually finished the process relatively early, but had a very successful, process with a couple different offers in the restructuring area, which is very exciting. So thought I'd get him on here to talk about just his process today, especially for those of you, like not everyone recruits for restructuring, but for those of you that are maybe interested in recruiting for restructuring, we'll get him to share some insights with you as well on just how the process went for him. So anyway, Lee, thank you for taking the time to talk to us today, man.
Yeah, no worries. Glad to.
Absolutely. So if you can maybe start off by just introducing yourself a little bit, so people know kind of who you are.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Lee. I go to the University of Chicago. I'm a busy con somebody like disregard the Cornell hoodie. This is just something I own, but I go to the University of Chicago. My background, I'm originally from Portland, so background not really traditionally in finance. Knew a lot about finance just because I had parents who'd worked in it previously, but traditional background of kind of law and entrepreneurship. That's primarily what I did before I came to college. In college, did a little bit of work with finance and investing, but definitely wasn't something that I was particularly keen on doing until kind of like late my first year. I'm going into my second year. Did a lot of different internships, worked in consulting, worked in wealth management, worked in finance, investment banking as well. And so definitely a lot of different experiences that kind of led me on the path towards investment banking and restructuring, but I think kind of all worthwhile experiences at the end of the day.
Got it. So I guess having tried all these different things, how did you ultimately like land on investment banking as like the thing you wanted to pursue, or maybe perhaps even more specifically restructuring?
Yeah. So I'll be honest, I actually didn't really recruit much for traditional investment banking. I think I went through maybe like one or two interviews, or I only ever applied to like places that had like the combination. So like Lazard, Rothschild, like those would be places that kind of had the restructuring M&A combination. M&A is something that I particularly wanted to do, but for restructuring in particular, it was a lot to do with my legal background. So I've worked with a federal judge. I had done a lot of legal work previously, and turns out that my mentor as well was a restructuring banker, and so I got a lot of insight into what that looked like. And I think for me, the combination of corporate finance and law was much more appealing, especially with restructuring, because it's so heavily focused on not only the corporate finance and kind of the work that you're able to do with these companies and their debt structures, but also like the legal ramifications, the political ramifications that are like constantly at play within these transactions. And so that's really what spoke to me and really why I wanted to do restructuring.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense because you had a lot of background already, and so you were kind of trying to leverage both that and your interest in finance. Okay, cool. So, like, what were, I guess, because you said you kind of started thinking about finance, late freshman year, early sophomore year, right? And I think you joined Wall Street Mastermind in like late November of sophomore year. So, like, prior to joining Wall Street Mastermind, like what were some of the things that you were doing on your own as far as, banking, recruiting, or like how were you going about your preparation process?
Good question. I think it was definitely like a very scattered process pre Wall Street Mastermind. I think that I didn't really have a lot of idea of what I should be doing or what I was going to do. I hopped on a couple of networking calls before, but those were definitely all people who like my mentor had known, or people who I like known from college and like were upperclassmen. But at the same time, like I had really no structure to a lot of my process. I was kind of going through different application processes. I didn't really understand like what I was filling out, how I should structure my resume. It was kind of going through kind of career advancement at the same time as well. And so it really just came down to like, I'd face an issue that came with recruiting. I'd look it up online, see what the answers were, and then kind of just proceed from there. Didn't think it was that helpful, but that's kind of what I was doing pre Wall Street Mastermind.
Got it. So what made you want to join Wall Street Mastermind then? Like, was there a particular thing that, or I don't know how you came across us, but like, was there a particular thing that made you say, hey, like, I think I want to like, get some more additional outside help versus just like trying to do everything on my own?
Yeah, I think for me, it was just 100% that I needed some sort of structure within my process. You know, again, as I briefly mentioned, it was very much like a scattered process. And so when I started this recruiting process, I wanted some level of structure in which I understood, like, this is the first thing I need to do. This is the second thing I need to do. This is the third thing I need to do. This is the fourth thing I need to do. And I think that that's what was really beneficial to me when I talked I think first on that call with I forgot his name, but like that first call I had with that person, like it was the structure that I think spoke to me most.
With Alex, I think you spoke to
Yes.
Alex, right? Yeah. Okay. Got it. Okay. So you were looking for some structure to your process. So you join in like late November, and now we fast forward, I guess, 5 months, right? You're done with the recruiting process. So like, kind of like walk us through the last 5 months that you've been in the program. Like, what were you doing inside of Wall Street Mastermind, and like, what did you find to be most helpful, I guess, for you?
Yeah. So I think the most helpful thing to me was kind of the whole networking process. So I will say, like with restructuring, there are slightly different technicals, and so while the technicals were helpful, they just like didn't cover everything else I actually needed to know. So I had to go outside to do a little bit of that as well for restructuring. But for me, it was definitely the two most helpful things I think were the networking portion, because I think that gave me a great guideline to just kind of tackle networking, which I know is a pretty daunting process, but it was super helpful to kind of like set up the spreadsheet, like know exactly how to contact people and what I should be writing in my emails. And that was really helpful. And secondly, the Slack channel is actually pretty helpful, because I think that like people are always willing to like hop on, answer your questions, and like it's a lot faster than just trying to say like Google an answer to a question, like a technical question, or like learning kind of behavioral questions. And so those were probably the two most beneficial things for me.
Okay. I mean, for those people who aren't in our program and probably don't know what you're talking about, like, tell us a bit more about what you're saying with like the Slack channel. Like, so how do you leverage that, or what was helpful about it?
Yeah, so for me in particular, the Slack channel I think was most helpful is that like it's broken down into tiers, right? And so like you can ask your behavioral questions, um you can ask your behavioral questions, you can ask your like technical questions, and then like either students or Sam will come in and like answer that for you. And so that's pretty helpful as well. And then at the same time, like people will post like questions that they've gotten from previous interviews. And so that was again really helpful, because you're kind of able to go through kind of like test yourself. That's one thing I did quite a bit, was like just look at the Slack channel, see what like people had written about restructuring questions, and then just like test myself before each and every interview that I went into.
Yeah. Got it. Yeah. So you're just talking about like the channels where everybody can ask questions and also see the answers to each other's questions, which I think like the big benefit to that is like sometimes, especially as a beginner, or not necessarily that you were a beginner, but like in general, like for people who are just starting out, sometimes you don't know what you don't know, or like you don't even know what questions you're supposed to be asking.
Yeah.
But being able to see other people's questions, a lot of times you realize like, oh yeah, I have the same question. Actually, I want to know the answer to that too. I'm sure that's happened for you. And then the second thing that you're kind of talking about is like our interview questions database, where people contribute the questions that they got into a centralized database that people can then go and access before their own interviews to see like, oh, these are the questions that typically get asked at this firm, and kind of just like know what to expect. Or even at different firms, like you said, for you, maybe it's just like you want to practice questions for restructuring, and other people that are going through restructuring interviews with these other elite boutiques, you can kind of like use those as practice questions, basically.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And so, like you mentioned, yeah, obviously, like restructuring, the technicals are different, right? So, like, how did you go about learning kind of the restructuring specific technicals? Because I think like we cover in the program kind of like the more traditional investment banking questions, and you learn all the foundational stuff that you need, like the three statements and valuation methodologies and M&A and LBOs. But then restructuring has like a incremental set of questions that you have to kind of prepare for, right? So like, how did you go about that?
Yeah, so it was so like definitely one of the most beneficial things. Like typically some firms focus on it a little more than others, but like certain firms were very heavily accounting focused in their question set. Like so if you took away all the restructuring components, they would be very heavily accounting focused. And so the accounting portion of the Wall Street Mastermind program was very helpful in that aspect. But when it came specifically to like just purely restructuring based questions, it kind of came down to reading a lot of the guides that are out there. I will say though that like distressed debt investing and then kind of the M&I guide for restructuring, they're both a little too simple compared to like what is actually told asked in interviews. I'll say like that's like the one thing that I've noticed is that like wherever you go online, all the questions that are being asked are far too simple compared to what is like typically now asked in a restructuring interview, especially at like a firm like Houlihan Lokey, which is like notorious for being very hard.
Right.
So like that, I say like it just came down to practice and like going through multiple interviews and like understanding what I could be asked. And then at the same time, another thing that I did was like there's a website called Petition. It's like a place in which someone like they constantly post different types of like restructuring cases and then like breakdowns of the cases. And so I would just kind of go there, read up on cases to get like a good better understanding of like what exactly was happening in this scenario, what exactly is happening in this scenario, so I can then like talk about the legal ramifications at the same
Got
time.
it.
Also, like networking as well was also very beneficial. You talk to networking contacts, they know what gets asked in these interviews, and so they'll be more helpful there.
Yeah. Restructuring cases, as in like these are like case questions, like very open ended, and you having to like tell them what you would do in certain situations.
Yeah, so like typically, like I can just give you an example. Like for one of my interviews, like they sat me down, they put in front of me like what was at that time like a new case, like XYZ company had like XYZ disaster occur to them. And so like this was their capital structure. This was how much in each tranche. These were kind of the covenants associated with that. Like, what would you advise the client? And so like kind of that was like 30 minutes of my interview was just being there, like talking with the associates about like what was the first step to take, what was the second step to take in the advisory process, like how should they manage like their liquidity issues, all of that stuff. And so like that was like reading through cases. Typically, like you'll find some sort of precedent that you can then bring up in another situation.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. So yeah, I mean, like, look, to your point, I mean, you're talking about, restructuring specifically right now, but I think that what we're seeing with even our students that aren't interviewing for restructuring or just interviewing for more traditional investment banking, it's the exact same thing that you said, which is most of the guys that are out there now, um, the questions in there aren't really being asked anymore, because I think what's happening is that, and I tell people this all the time, but like 5 years ago, 10 years ago, if you read these, well, probably not 5 years ago, but like 10 years ago, if you read these guides, back then they were still relatively new and like people hadn't really caught on yet. And so it's like, even just by reading these guides, you were already kind of ahead of the curve. Right. But nowadays, like realistically, everyone that's interviewing for investment banking has read the M&I 400 questions guide, right? Or like everybody's read the Wall Street Oasis guide, and so like the interviewers know this too. In fact, a lot of your interviewers, like they haven't been in banking for that long, and they themselves read those guides when they were interviewing, and like they know exactly what's in there, right? And now you're no longer ahead of the curve just by reading these guides. And so if people like, for the interviewer's perspective, like if they just ask you the exact same questions that are in these guides, it doesn't really help them separate like the really great candidates from just like everybody else.
Yeah.
Right. And so they have to start asking like questions that are not from the guides, and also like these case study type questions that are a lot more open ended. It's like you cannot realistically like memorize the answer ahead of time, because you don't know what the case is going to be, and it's so open ended that like it's not even that there might not even be necessarily like one right answer. It's more like what direction do you want to take it in, and you have to be able to think on your feet and actually like apply the knowledge that you've already learned. And the degree of difficulty for doing something like that is much, much, much higher than just like regurgitating some answer that you memorized for like a predetermined question. Right. So I think like this is a really, really important point that most people need to realize, is like, you can't just keep prepping the same way that people used to prep 10 years ago and expect to be like really competitive. Like nowadays, like that's not really good enough anymore. And I'm sure like 5 years from now, 10 years from now, things will change again. Like things only get harder, right? Like the thing about like, okay, you go to a top college right now, like it was so much harder for you to get into a top school than it probably was during like your parents' time, and then for your parents, like it was probably so much harder than it was for like their grandparents' time. Like it's just things only get more competitive over time. And with like the internet, like information is everywhere now. Like everybody has access to the same information. So it's like, what is actually your competitive advantage? Like that's something that's, I think, really worth like people thinking about when they first set out to prepare for something and they're like trying to decide how they want to approach it. Right.
No, I will say that like my very first interview, I had only read the guides before I came in, and I got absolutely like destroyed on a technical question. Like I sat there fully not knowing how to answer the question.
Yeah.
And I obviously didn't move on to the next round afterwards. And so like that was very much like a realization that like I can't just read these guides. Like it's not going to help me.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Who was that with? Houlihan?
Yeah, it was I interviewed for two of Houlihan's offices, LA and Chicago, and that was for LA.
Yeah. Yeah. Houlihan's rough.
Yeah.
um, okay. So I guess, that, I mean, that's really, really helpful insight, by the way. So, so you recruited for restructuring. So like ultimately, like how many firms did you end up interviewing with? And so you interviewed with Houlihan, and like how many other firms did you talk to?
So I interviewed. I can just list them. I think, but I just call it. Yeah, I might just have to list them. I don't really remember it. It was a lot, but it was like so. Mizuho, um, Green Hill, Evercore, Lazard. Uh, it's like seven firms I interviewed with.
Okay, got it. And so like ultimately, like where did you end up getting offers from?
So I got an offer, like a written offer from Piper, and then I got like a phone call from Green Hill. But at that point, like I'd already taken the offer, so it just was. I just like told the Green Hill recruiter like they asked like if I'd like to join. And I said like, look, the offer's already signed. Like I'd love to, but maybe another time.
Yeah, got it. Okay. Yeah, I mean that's kind of the nature of the beast, which is a lot of these firms, some recruit much earlier than others, and a lot of times you're under the gun and you just have to kind of decide if you're happy enough with the offer or not, right? But I think Piper is actually quite good in restructuring though, so I think it's a very good offer. So I think that's great. Um, and so you'll be interning at Piper this upcoming summer, and then your plan is to do restructuring for probably like your foreseeable future as well, then for full time and
Yeah,
after you get out of college, I assume.
yeah, I think so. For me, it's definitely like the career that's interested me the most. Like maybe we'll do corporate development one day, but for like a company that I'm interested in. But just yeah, I probably will want to get a law degree at some point, just because it's like a pretty useful thing to have within restructuring.
Right.
But and an MBA combined at the same time. But yeah, probably restructuring for the long term, maybe move around a few firms. I will say like the benefit of networking is that you get to meet not only analysts but also associates, VPs, MDs, and so like at the end of the day, like create a strong enough connection with an MD and like you can always like talk to them again another time.
Yeah, for sure. Um, so like, I guess last question for you, like, what's one piece of advice that you have for maybe people who are just starting to go through the process as they're listening to this, or maybe specifically for people that want to recruit for something that's not as traditional, like something like a restructuring. Was there like a piece of advice that someone gave you at one point along the way that just like really, helped you out or made a big difference for you that you want to kind of pass down to other people?
Yeah. So I guess like two pieces of advice. First one, and this is probably something that people say a lot, but like do start like very early. Like at the end of the day, it was the networking contacts that I got in like January and February who were ultimately like, the people who like a couple of times like people would actively push HR for me to have an interview early. And so like it was those people who I had met in like January, February who I had developed a relationship with who were like willing to go to HR and like push my interviews forward. And so that happened a couple of times. And then the second thing is like even if you recruit for like a very specific field, like I'll make the note is like you're not really siloed. Like at least for restructuring, it's like they like to think of themselves as better than the M&A guys and better at valuation than the M&A guys. And I'll see if that's true later. But like at the end of the day, like you're just an analyst. And so like even if you like purely target one, like you can always kind of come back. I know people who've like at the VP level transitioned into healthcare out of restructuring or even into just like more traditional M&A. So
Yeah. I mean, look, I will say like restructuring is probably like one of the most technical groups in banking. So it's like if you want a lateral from like a more technical group back to like a relatively less technical group, which is basically like everybody else, I think that's like not hard to do, right? But like if you're trying to lateral from like, I don't know, ECM, where you don't do like any modeling, into like restructuring, like in the other direction, um, that's probably not going to work very well, right? But I agree with you though. Like, restructuring is definitely like more specialized than I think for someone like you who has a background in law, and it's just a very good fit. I think it makes a lot of sense.
Mhm.
But otherwise, like, for people, I think the people that are going to restructuring need to like really genuinely have a good reason for doing so and know that that's what they want to do. And then like, like even if you don't stay in banking, like in the future, like your expertise is kind of like working with distressed companies, which is like a very, it's definitely like a more niche thing, right? It's not like good or bad. It's just like different. It's just like a
Yeah.
personal preference thing. And so like, you just have to like really know what you're getting yourself into. That's kind of what I would tell people, right?
Yeah, I actually I agree with that because I think it like they would always ask like why you into restructuring. Like I think like on the practice interviews, like the more very specific you could be about why restructuring, the more like the interviewer wouldn't always feel like it was very clear like when they went out like would have heard an answer that was like, something they'd heard probably 100 times in the past. And so I think just like having that legal background was something that like let me be different in the sense that like every time I talked about my background and why I wanted to do restructuring, it wasn't like the same common answer. And I think that benefited from me kind of just like going through the program, like just learning how to train that question over time.
Like how to answer the behavioral questions. Yeah. I mean, like on the behavioral side, it's like, that part is actually probably not that different
Yeah.
in terms of like how you answer behavioral questions for traditional banking roles versus restructuring roles. Sure, like the content's going to be slightly different, and you're going to have to tweak certain things, like why restructuring instead of why banking and things like that. But like for the most part, behavioral questions, like you can use kind of the same structure or like the same frameworks for the answers that we usually teach, and that usually still works pretty well, I would assume, right?
Yeah, like I think like the only difference would be like when you talk about deals, like you're not talking about like accretion dilution. You're not talking about like what happens in the deal and why the deal benefits you. Like you're much more talking about like why the deal happens, like what were like the legal or like financial like actions taken by both sides to increase their value. And so like it's a different understanding, but at the same time, like it's still the same level of framework for everything else.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a great point. Cool. So guys, for those of you that are still listening, if you are kind of similar to what Lee just did, which is like you want to recruit for something like restructuring, I think first and foremost, I would say restructuring recruiting is like probably relatively speaking more advanced, right? And so before you can even like learn the restructuring stuff, you really still need like the foundation. You need to learn the foundational stuff. Like you don't understand your accounting, you don't know your three statements, you know how valuation works. Like you're not going to be able to like get to the more advanced level restructuring type technicals, right? And then like there's also lots of different aspects of recruiting, such as your resume, your networking, your behavioral interviews, that are kind of like universally applicable across the board, regardless of whether you want to recruit for traditional banking or for restructuring. So, if you guys are looking for help with any of these things, and you kind of like just like you want like the most structured and efficient way to go about it, as opposed to being like kind of scattered and doing everything on your own, then I would encourage you to reach out to our team and to work with us. Like you do have to apply, and because we don't have the bandwidth to work with everyone, so reach out to our team, and if we feel like you're a good fit, then we can walk you through how we think we might be able to help you. And we basically won't invite anyone to our program unless we feel very confident that we can get them a very good offer. So this I don't think this was a thing when you joined Lee, but like within the last 5 or 6 months or so, like we rolled out like a new money back guarantee that we didn't used to have, right? And so it's like we've always operated in a way where we don't invite people into the program if we don't think we can confidently get them the job. But now it's just like we're taking that to the next level and like saying, if we don't get you the job, like we're putting our money where our mouth is, right? So anyway, like that's why it's definitely like by application only, because otherwise like we just can't work with everybody. So if you guys are interested in that, reach out to us, book a call. We'll hop on, we'll learn more about your situation and what it is that you need help with, and also what your goals are and what kind of jobs you want to recruit for. And then at a minimum, we'll give you some advice on what we think you should do, regardless of whether you work with us or not. But if you do want to work with us and we think you're a good fit, then we're happy to talk about what that might look like. All right. So if you guys want to do that, you can go to www.wallstreetmastermind.com/apply. The street is abbreviated to ST. So it's wallstmastermind.com/apply. All right, guys. So with that said, we're going to wrap it up here. Lee, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us today. This was, I think, really helpful, and we don't do too many restructuring client interviews around here. And so it was definitely good to get you on here and just share your insight, and especially for our listeners that are interested in restructuring. But I want to congratulate you again on getting some amazing offers, and wish you the best at Piper. This, I guess, it's not this upcoming summer, but for summer 2023, and then obviously also beyond that. Can't wait to see what else you're able to accomplish and all the success that you have ahead of you. So, with that said, guys, that'll be it for today. Okay, thank you guys for tuning in, and hopefully this is helpful to you guys. And we'll be back with more of these for you guys in the near future. Okay, talk to you guys soon. Bye.